his opening remarks and to set the scene for today's discussion. President, you have the floor, please.
Good afternoon, Ambassador Zanier, and good afternoon to all colleagues, and welcome to this virtual roundtable, which is, as you will be aware, the second event that we have held under the umbrella of the OSCE's Call for Action. The first had 130 participants and included many of the former OSCE Parliamentary Assembly presidents, OSCE chairs and secretaries general. And this is going to be well attended as well, I trust. One thing I would like to make clear is that the Call for Action was the initiative of former President George Tsereteli, and he launched it at the Ministerial Council in December, just before he gave up his role as president as a result of the Georgian elections. The initial call for action was signed by all the important former participants in the OSCE and the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. One of the things I want to underline, however, is that subsequently the current Bureau of the Parliamentary Assembly has jointly and severally added their names to the call for action. And so the event and the initiative is one of the current leadership as well as the past leadership. Now, this afternoon we are looking at the whole question of consensus and how the consensus works in the OSCE, because it's important, I think, to recall that the Parliamentary Assembly is not bound by consensus in the same way, although the rule does apply to us in the Standing Committee, and particularly should we want to change the rules. I don't think that it's for us as a Parliamentary Assembly to try and tell the Ministerial Council or the Permanent Council how to resolve the obvious difficulties which do arise out of consensus. Consensus has been used to prevent decisions, close field operations, and obstruct key meetings, and that's obviously detrimental to the work of the OSCE. However, it was conceived to guarantee the concerns of smaller participating states, and in many ways consensus reinforces the legitimacy of actions taken by OSCE themselves. And indeed, I think we need to be very careful before we start calling for the abolition of consensus altogether, to ask ourselves, what would that actually do to the organization? Would we find ourselves in a situation where some key players, even if they are players that we don't agree with by and large, decided that they wanted to leave? And one of the strengths of this organization is that it does incorporate everybody, as we say routinely in publications, all the countries from Vladivostok to Vancouver, and we wouldn't want to be losing that. We have, as a Parliamentary Assembly, from time to time looked quite carefully at the whole question of consensus, and reference has been made to it in annual declarations. And we've suggested from time to time that there should be reform of the decision-making processes and increasing transparency and accountability. We also have looked at whether there is scope for better use of consensus -1 rule, which has only been used, I think, in 1992 in connection with the dispute in the former Republic of Yugoslavia, when the then Federal Republic was suspended. And there have been various suggestions that it should consensus should not be applied when the dissenting parties were the parties to the conflict. We've also called from time to time about better use of the Moscow mechanism, and I don't quite know how this has worked, but I must have probably have been a party to calling for it. Approximate consensus, which means decisions would be taken by, if approved, by 90%. Therefore, colleagues, I think there is a great deal for us to discuss in connection with consensus. I will not take up any more of your time this afternoon. I've tried to highlight some of the positions that we have taken as a Parliamentary Assembly, and the object of the exercise this afternoon is to hear from you. There has been, and I thank the Secretariat for it, a very useful managing consensus of the OSCE, the non-paper, which should aid our discussions very much. One domestic matter, which I will perhaps just mention, is that you're coming here this afternoon to the second meeting of Call for Action. And a piece of outstanding business for the Bureau is to decide exactly what the roadmap for this exercise is and where it's going and for how long it's going to take. This in no way does invalidate the discussion and your views, but just so that you are aware that the leadership of the Assembly knows that we need an objective and a timeline and a general indication of how matters are going to proceed. With that, I thank you for the floor and thank you for listening, and I hope we have a very fruitful discussion this afternoon. Ambassador Zanier, thank you.
Thank you, President. Thank you, Lord Baroness. Let me now move to introducing the panel, but before doing so, a couple of comments from my side. First of all, as you have seen, we have circulated a food for thought paper. It is really what it says it is. It's a bit of a piece of brainstorming to give you some ideas of possible options that might be considered. And obviously, this is not exhaustive. There may be other suggestions that can be taken into account in this debate. The Parliamentary Assembly itself, and we've been looking into that, has passed a really high number of, in its declarations, of statements on the consensus issue, beginning in '93 and ending in 2019, the Luxembourg Declaration. So there is quite a history also of this debate within the Parliamentary Assembly. But we thought it useful to start by asking the head of the legal office, the Office of Legal Affairs of the Secretariat, Stephen Walsh, who has kindly accepted to join us today, to give us his view of what is the legally, quote unquote, obviously the OSCE has no legal personality as such, but of course there are rules, and to tell us what his perception is when it comes to the consensus rule. Then we will have a number of panelists that will comment on this and will put forward their own views. We have three vice presidents, Margareta Sederfeld, Kari Henriksen. Last in the list is Azai Guliev, who told us that he has some commitments in the Azerbaijani parliament and will join us a bit later, but he's still very keen to intervene. And then we invited Dr. Hamilton, Daniel Hamilton, who is the director of the Global Europe Program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, who has been working on a project on the OSCE over the last few months, and he has issued a report. I think the report is out by now, or is about to be published, on strengthening the OSCE, looking at the OSCE overall. And so some of his recommendations may be very relevant for our process and for discussion. And we thought it would be a good idea to give an opportunity also to put forward his own thoughts and share his own thoughts concerning this sensitive topic of consensus. Finally, coming close to the point that the President just raised on the process itself, which is a discussion that I think should begin in the Bureau, and then the Standing Committee should probably wish to also comment on this. I would like to share with you two suggestions for topics of the next two meetings of this process over the next 2-3 months. One could be topics that we have picked from the first brainstorming session. One could be how to revitalize the dialogue in the organization and raise the profile of the organization, so the broader set of issues about the OSCE and make it more functional. And the second, a number of challenges came up in the debate on specifically on the human dimension. For this, perhaps we could work with Ambassador Stroval, who is with us today, and some of the previous directors of ODIHR, to look at the challenges on the implementation of commitments and on other operational constraints that have emerged, especially in the human dimension. But of course, the work should then cover every aspect and every dimension of the work of the OSCE. So feel free also to comment on these suggestions, these ideas in the course of your interventions. With this, I would like to give the floor to Stephen Walsh, the Head of Office of Legal Affairs, for him to share with us his understanding of where we are when it comes to consensus. Stephen, thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Zanier. Good afternoon, President. Good afternoon, dear distinguished members of the Parliamentary Assembly. I'm very honoured to have been asked to say a few words by way of a background note to this issue that goes to the very heart of the OSCE. As you will all know, the OSCE is based upon politically rather than legally binding decisions. That said, a legal eye is often called upon to interpret certain provisions of OSCE decisions and to put them in the context of the broader OSCE framework. Allow me to share with you an insight from my experience as a legal advisor at the OSCE that may be of some relevance to this discussion. We at the Office of Legal Affairs receive many requests for interpretation of OSCE decisions by the annual chairs so as to help them navigate potentially contentious issues concerning their role of presiding over the Permanent Council. But to the best of my knowledge, we have not received a single query about the consensus principle. If it seems that a proposed decision will not attain consensual support, such as the proposed reappointments of the senior posts in the organisation last summer, the chair must swiftly move on to attempt some alternative proposal, rather than having recourse to a more flexible form of decision-making. Thus, one might ask the question of whether it must always be a case of full consensus or nothing at all at the OSCE. The principle of consensus has been a feature since the days of the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The principle of consensus was maintained during the transformation into the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe with the Budapest Decision of 1994. It was subsequently retained when the OSCE Rules of Procedure were adopted in 2006. Rule 2A2 of the Rules of Procedure provides that consensus shall be understood to mean the absence of any objection expressed by a participating state to the adoption of the decision in question. The OSCE is in the minority of international organizations that maintain such a requirement for consensus. Other examples are the Executive Committee of the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, NATO, and the Association of South Asian Nations. The requirement for consensus reflects the sacrosanct principle in international law of equality of states, regardless of asymmetries in areas like military power, geographical and population size, levels of industrialization, and economic development. As well as the obvious benefit of legitimacy and acceptability that come with a consensual decision, the significance of the adherence to such an egalitarian principle in an international organization focusing on security matters, are surely apparent to all. That having been said, sovereign states are free, as sovereign actors under international law, to agree to arrange international organizations in ways other than requiring consensus for decision-making. Not only do arrangements in some international organizations allow for majority rule rather than a requirement for consensus, states can agree to such arrangements that afford stronger voting power to some states than others. Examples can be found in the right to veto being exclusively for the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, or the qualified majority system at the European Council and the Council of the European Union. While the OSCE is synonymous with the consensus principle, it is itself not an absolute adherent to the principle, as we have heard from the President of the Parliamentary Assembly moments ago, as it allows, in limited circumstances, very limited circumstances, two exceptions to the rule. One is the consensus -1 method of decision-making that allows the OSCE to take action in cases of clear, gross, and uncorrected violations of relevant OSCE commitments without the consent of the state concerned. The other example is the consensus -2 method that can be used to direct any two participating states to seek conciliation to assist them in resolving a dispute that they have not been able to settle within a reasonable period of time. These two methods were adopted in 1992 in the Prague and Stockholm decisions, respectively. Their inclusion in the 2006 OSCE Rules of Procedure is discreetly achieved by the aforementioned Rule 2A2, which establishes that decisions shall be adopted by consensus, but also adds that it does so without prejudice to the earlier adopted CSCE/OSCE documents referred to in Annex 2 of the Rules of Procedure, these being the aforementioned 1992 Prague and Stockholm decisions. Shortly after the introduction of the possibility for a decision based on consensus -1, the method was applied in the context of the suspension of the former Federal Republic of Yugoslavia from the meetings of the equivalent of today's Permanent Council, due to the concerns on the human rights situation in the former Yugoslavia at the time. However, after that decision, there are no records of the consensus -1 method being used, while the consensus -2 principle has not been used so far. The very existence of these two options may, though, serve to show that it has already been acknowledged that consensus has its limitations in certain circumstances. One might also suggest that along with these two de jure methods of arriving at a decision where consensus seems not possible, there exists a de facto method that occurs more frequently. That being that determined participating states successfully encourage wavering participating states to join and complete the consensus. Whether reliance on such measures is optimal may be something for this group to discuss today and in future. And so, in conclusion, we can see that the predominance of the consensus principle in the OSCE we can see the predominance of the consensus principle throughout the decades in the OSCE, but also that it is not an absolute rule for every circumstance, and that the OSCE's participating states, as sovereign states, are free to agree, perhaps ironically through consensus, to extending decision-making through a level of agreement less than consensus for other areas of the OSCE's affairs. Thank you very much, dear Parliamentary Assembly members, for your attention, and I wish you well in your discussions on this very interesting matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for your considerations. Of course, the issue of do we need consensus to change consensus is a tricky one. So I appreciate the fact that you're being very practical in your considerations. Now let's see what the panelists think about this, and then I already have a few of you who have asked for the floor afterwards. So let's begin with Margareta Sederfeld. Please, Margareta.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sanier. Mr. President, dear heads and members of delegations, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to take part in today's webinar and discuss the call for action and the consensus with you. As leaders and members of the national delegations, are your participation at today's meeting very important. I do look forward to the following discussion and to take part of your remarks. With cooperation and contribution from the 57 OSCE PA national delegations can call for action develop to milestone for the OSCE as a whole. The foundation of OSCE, inclusive OSCE PA, is the Helsinki Final Act, and Helsinki Final Act celebrates its 50th anniversary year 2025. Our questions we have debated for a long time in OSCE PA is the need to increase the impact of our work. The same question is on the table for the OSCE. Thus, it is a common challenge for both of the parts of the organization. Call for action is first and most an action to increase the input of our work. However, to increase the level of influence by the OSCE PA on today's politics, do we also need to include all the different perspectives within the OSCE family? As parliamentarians, we are used to the method of majority voting as a demonstration of democracy. And we use this method in our work inside the OSCE PA as well. This principle, however, is not applicable in the OSCE. The consensus rule goes back to the origins of the OSCE and is aimed to protect the security of all OSCE member states. On the other hand, is this the best way to perform decisions these days? Our current times might be the right to question what the scope of the consensus rule should be. It might further ask which areas other voting methods could be used, such as qualified majority or qualified consensus. Let me give one example. The issue of appointments in the OSCE on the governmental side, countries that have put forward current candidates for a key position should not be part of the formal decision-making process, with the only exception being the consensus at the ministerial level once the consultative process has been completed. This procedure aims to avoid conflict of interest. In addition, there are alternatives to formal decisions on agendas and modalities of meetings. The chairpersonship should be allowed to consult and make its own decision based on what is advisable and possible. With this model, the chair is accountable to all participating states concerning its decisions. When it comes to the political decisions at the ministerial level, it is understandable that consensus should be the rule, unless perhaps in case where there are such grave violations of Helsinki Final Act and its related commitments by an individual country that the ministers can decide to act in consensus -1, following the example of the past decisions in the same modality during the 90s. There are precedents to duly take into account. Nonetheless, whenever consensus is not reached or granted by any participating states, this should be put on record and there should be satisfactory explanation and consequence. Clear accountability of the reasons why a country is not joining general consensus. To conclude, no part of an organization can operate in a vacuum. Of course, as parliamentarians and members of the OSCE PA, we should gain a greater impact, which is critical to allow us to contribute and serve our countries at the best of our abilities. The OSCE must also increase its relevance and political impact. I look forward to working together with all of you for more relevant OSCE and look forward to listen to my fellow colleagues and your remarks in the discussion. And thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I am finished.
Yeah, thank you, Vice President Satterfield. Thank you so much for your remarks. Let's move on now to Dr. Hamilton, who is, among other things, also himself an old OSCE hand, and I'm really looking forward to hearing his take on this. Dan, you have the floor. Good morning to you.
Thank you, Lamberto. Just checking that you can hear me.
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you all. It's a privilege to be with you today. I want to thank Lamberto and the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. I see many old friends here. So I read the paper with interest. As Lamberto said, I've been working on a project on the future of the OSCE. I put in the chat the link to that report in case it is of interest to you. I believe any number of changes are imaginable. And the paper, I think, did a good job outlining a number of options, each of which probably needs to be refined a bit further to be a practical consequence, but that's something that could be done. I should say I'm speaking for myself. This is my own personal view. I'm not representing anyone. My inclination would be to say that while the consensus rule remains important when it comes to central security issues, it could be modified on administrative procedural issues so that the organization can operate more effectively and efficiently. We would need to distinguish between certain kinds of administrative rules. For instance, would it be the budget, senior appointments, renewal of mission mandates, just meeting agendas. So I think that's where I say we have to refine this a bit. One of the options there goes into this, but I would encourage you to think about, exactly the prioritization and which elements. I like the mechanism of accountability. I think that's been an important part of the OSCE, but again, more accountability, the better. But again, that was one brief, short paragraph. So of course we need to explore that. My second point would be that I should say, discussion with the U.S. Helsinki Commission colleagues who are here, and I want to thank them for their counsel always, that, current mechanisms are also underutilized, the mechanisms that already exist, and more could be done to make use of them. More matters, for instance, perhaps could be left to the chair in office, or perhaps the Troika, after consulting with participating states. The chair in office has the ability to decide quite a few things on its own, and that could be expanded. There are also, if I'm correct, there are mechanisms for unusual military activities and for emergency meetings, which have allowed things to happen, meetings to happen without consensus to schedule them. So there is a basket of issues and opportunities that simply could be utilized better already. My third point would be to say that we can imagine all of these options, but I have to be blunt or clear that I think most of the OSCE's problems are not institutional, they are political. And bureaucratic tweaks really can't overcome the lack of commitment by participating states to uphold the Paris, Helsinki, Astana principles. This doesn't mean the OSCE can't do valuable work, but I believe it's quite important to be grounded in reality and understand what the central issues are. And as I think has been said by Mr. Walsh and others, it takes consensus to change consensus. That'll be the basis of any change. So it's a little tricky. The paper, in my view, implies with regard to Yugoslavia, and maybe Mr. Walsh can refine this, but that the other participating states simply achieved consensus among themselves to exclude Yugoslavia. Maybe I read it wrong, but I think in reality, the Prague mechanism was adopted at a ministerial, but the decision to suspend Yugoslavia was taken later in Helsinki at a follow-up meeting. And at first, I think it suspended Yugoslavia from decision-making related to the CSCE response to the Bosnian conflict. And the Yugoslav delegation actually remained at the table and was there and could speak. It was only later that a decision was made to suspend Yugoslav participation altogether after the Helsinki summit in 1992. So I think, again, some refinement and to be clear about these mechanisms. Both the two mechanisms that are being discussed were consensually agreed and are invoked by one state or a group of states. And I think, as Mr. Walsh said, when Yugoslavia was suspended, it was done on basis of the document, the criteria that he quoted, and I just want to repeat that: clear, gross, and uncorrected violations, unquote, of commitments regarding democracy, human rights, rule of law. So that's a high bar. It can't simply be transferred to other situations, that type of mechanism. There's a criteria that has been established. So with all of that in mind, I welcome the paper. I think it's useful to examine options. I think it needs some more refinement. And finally, let's not forget where the real problems are. I don't believe they're here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, for your reflections. Very, very interesting points that you're making. We have taken note, and we'll try to reflect them also in a kind of a perception paper that we will issue after this meeting, having listened to all of you. Let's move on with the panel, and the next is Vice President Henriksen, Kari Eriksen from Norway. Please, you have the floor, Kari.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sanja. And dear colleagues, as elected MPs, we are accountable to our voters. We have a shared responsibility to realize the OSCE's principles as outlined in the Helsinki Act of 1975 and the Paris Charter of 1990. In the OSCE PA, we make statements and decisions on a broad range of issues. It's sometimes hard to find a common thread and to generate common input to the OSCE. We decide upon a broad range of resolutions and supplementary items. Is this the best way of achieving our goals, or can we as MPs prioritize better? The OSCE operates by the consensus rules. In effect, the use of consensus at every steps of the decision-making process results in a micromanagement of the organization by participating states. It can completely block any area of activity. Is this the best way for the OSCE to achieve our common goals? Of course, consensus is an important safety valve. It basically gives everybody veto power over decision-making. But this veto power should be exercised in a balanced way. Today, there is no means to determine the damage to the common interests that any individual veto may cause. Challenging the consensus rules may have some consequences. As Mr. Walsh mentioned, for instance, would it be replaced with stronger vote weight for some countries? Or, as Dr. Hamilton mentioned, can we use the consensus rules on some issues and not in others? And I think that is the reason that it's very important and interesting to discuss this rule. But we must make sure that the sum of all our efforts supports the common values and principles of the OSCE. Therefore, it is important that we, as elected MPs, take part in the process around the call for action together with the OSCE. I would like to thank President Bonis and the Secretary General Roberto for their efforts in this regard. As MPs, we must support the expectation by our respective governments that no decisions are taken which might affect security, stability, and more generally, run counter to the legitimate interests of our countries. But the role of Parliament is also to scrutinize government policy, which makes it important that the use of veto powers by our governments is also scrutinized. At a minimum, when it comes to important decisions by the organization. There are different options open to us. We in the OSCE PA might consider to establish an opening for tabling called parliamentary questions on such matters as vetoes to substantive decisions, blocking the calendar of agendas of important meetings, the adoption of significant decisions, or the appointment of key officials, or invite ministers to give statement on a certain issue. Some kind of government accountability is needed. MPs could and should play a role in this regard, both nationally and in the OSCE PA. By generating political interest in our national parliaments and with our governments, we can raise the profile of the OSCE. My experience, as I have raised questions in my own parliament, and my experience is that this has led to fruitful debates about OSCE's commitments, policies, and broader knowledge on the OSCE. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice President Henriksen, for your points. I think it's very interesting, actually, this issue also of the political level of attention to avoid that any delegate in Vienna just because he's in a bad mood may block things. So that there has to be some kind of a broader process to make sure there is no abuse of the consensus. The next speaker, Vice President Guliev Azai, you have the floor, please. Glad you could make it. You are muted. Can you unmute yourself, please, Azai?
Okay. Do you hear me?
Yes, okay now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Zanier, dear President Lord Bonis, distinguished colleagues and participants. First of all, let me thank our Assembly, particularly President Bonis and Secretary General Mantella, for holding the second meeting of the working group on the Helsinki Plus 50 process. As we have already started to discuss today, another crucial important issue like the principle of consensus. The principle of consensus and commitments enshrined in the Helsinki Final Act of 1975 constitute the very foundation of security and the functioning of the OSCE. In an inclusive organization as ours, no country's views can be ignored at any step of our internal processes. The use of consensus as a decision-making method of the OSCE goes back to the origins of our organization and has been reconfirmed on a number of occasions. It has to be mentioned that the OSCE regularly been heavily criticized for its slow and complicated decision-making procedure resting on the principle of consensus. Some of the criticism is reasonable, but some of them is not justified. I'm convinced that the consensus approach to the decisions should be kept. The consensual procedure is more a strength than a weakness of the OSCE, as it substantially increases the probability that the taken decisions and assumed commitments will be in fact be implemented. And as we all know, security is indivisible. Introducing exceptions to the consensus rule would result in endangering the security needs of one or more members by ignoring their positions. Nevertheless, I would underline that achieving consensus within the OSCE has become increasingly difficult. Protracted negotiations on the budget, appointments of personnel, and general administrative issues have hampered the effectiveness of the organization and created turbulent situations. It should be also mentioned that any attempt to distinguish between administrative and political decisions is unrealistic and artificial. For instance, any decisions involving resources would entail financial responsibilities by participating states, and therefore there is no alternative to consensus in these cases. Nobody should be able to impose extra costs to any of our countries to implement decisions to which individual countries might not have been part. I would also like to stress that the issues concerning agenda and organizational modalities of the OSCE meetings can be very political. Inviting one external guest or a partner organization instead of another, selected civil society organizations is certainly politically sensitive. Therefore, we as the Parliamentary Assembly should not stand aside. We have to take part in the evolution process of the OSCE and suggest new and smooth solutions for tackling the challenges of the current situation. If we recall the Helsinki Plus 40 project of OSCE, we will see that it was mainly a declaratory document with no concrete outcomes and follow-ups. We cannot allow it to happen again. Despite that, we have nearly 4 years for presenting Helsinki Plus 50. We need to start working from now and make sure that this process produces concrete outcomes and avoids previous gaps of the Helsinki Plus 40 project. Dear colleagues, for the validation of the outcomes of the working group, I would suggest an appointment of the facilitator from the PA. This facilitator has to present a tentative 6-month work plan to the Bureau, which would be eventually endorsed by the Standing Committee. For achieving the ultimate goal of the Helsinki Plus 50, the facilitator has to be granted with a clear and strong mandate by the Assembly. I would propose that, therefore, every call for action meeting, the facilitator would produce a non-paper also reflecting the views informally collected from the governmental side to encourage strengthening the effectiveness of OSCE policies, streamlining the agenda, raising the profile of organization, and if it is necessary, even promoting reform of OSCE procedures and practices. To be frank, it is my personal conviction that Ambassador Lambert de Zanier, you who have enough experience, capacity, and reputation for being entrusted by PA in fulfilling this crucial and labor-intensive task. In conclusion, I would suggest for minimizing the possible effect of the principle of consensus to significantly increase transparency in the OSCE. Debates within the organization should be more open and transparent and not just limited to issues where a consensus is achieved, but also should extend to unsettled matters where consensus is absent. Saying this, I would acknowledge the significant role of the members of our Assembly who are acting as intermediaries among the national parliaments, the OSCE and its institutions to elaborate the Helsinki Plus 50 project, which could make our organization stronger and help to achieve our common goals. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Vice President, for your comments. Take a note also of the operational suggestion you put forward. That's, of course, for discussion in other contexts, but feel free also, anybody else, to comment on these points, also following the appeal of the President in its introductory remarks. So thank you very much. With this, we conclude the interventions by the panel. I have already a list of 6 or 7 speakers that I have already requested, actually 8, that have requested the floor. So I will start immediately with the first. And of course, if you can also ask questions to the panelists. The only one who has to leave early, as far as I know, is Dan Hamilton, who has another commitment in a while, but he can still be with us for a little while. So the first of the speakers on my list is Monsieur Pascal Alizard, Vice-Président. Vous avez la parole. Sorry, you have the floor. Vice-President Alizard, we cannot hear you. There must be some technical problems, so we will return later to Mr. Alizard. Second is former President Severin, Adrian Severin. Please, you have the floor, Mr. Severin.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. Good afternoon, colleagues. During my presidency, I have addressed quite a lot this issue of the consensus rule. And I'm not going to speak today in terms of in more theoretical terms. Indeed, the theoretical aspects have been already tackled. I would say that the key issue when addressing this topic of consensus rule is how to cope with the abuses. Abuse of single country veto, where it leads the consensus rule, and abuse of any other rules of decision making. So in answering these concerns, some would say that, of course, there could be no abuse for somebody who is acting in its own right. And this is also true. And I agree with something which has been said a little bit before, that indeed the political questions are very important to be addressed before we find a solution to the consensus rule. However, I think to overcome these dilemmas, one must develop a system of transparency and accountability. This would be very important. Those vetoing a decision should offer detailed reasons for doing that. Those overruling a minority opinion should also explain why they did it and what measures did they take in order to comfort that minority. Perhaps, Mr. Zanier, one should also adopt rules which will allow those affected to appeal the decisions resulted from the mentioned abuses. Some kind of a system of appeal, maybe the experts could tell us, to give us more ideas. My second point, the rules for adopting decisions should be diversified. To my mind, this is very clear. I'm not going to go into details, but I think that I understand that it is very difficult to distinguish between the different category of rules, because any decision has a political dimension. There is practically no decision without a political dimension. So this matter of distinguishing could be addressed, to my mind, maybe we can think for a different meeting, could be addressed by on the basis of some expert appraisals. Some experts could give us some ideas on how could we distinguish between the strategic decision, administrative decision, tactical decision, and so on and so forth. Certainly budget is there and so on, but I think we have to concentrate specifically on the criteria for distinction. And maybe also we could, one could adopt, when lacking a general definition, a rule which would allow those concerned to make a decision of distinguishing on a case-to-case basis. I would have some other points, but I would address the last one. And I would say that OSCE, whatever we might think about the merits or about the liabilities of the consensus rule, I believe that OSCE needs majorities which decide rather than minorities which block. In order to facilitate the balance of those two groupings' interests, while allowing the majority to move ahead, maybe one should think to an opting out system and or to adopting a list of certain topics or certain procedures which might be put on the agenda or started respectively at the initiative of a minimal number of participating states. So I think that we have to find this kind of possibilities to move with ideas, move with topics, move with procedures, even if there is no consensus. At least without consensus, we might start some debates, we might start some procedures. So for the rest, I would pass you, Mr. Ambassador, some written ideas. I think that there is no perfect solution on that. It's obvious that there is no perfect solution. However, we have to look towards limiting the abuses to a reasonable extent, thus making a more flexible system of decision making sufficiently secure and therefore acceptable for all. As far as your proposal for the next meetings, I think that the human dimension well, is it all right? Are we still together? Yes, thank you. This is, indeed about the dialogue, it's also important. You disappeared from my computer for a while and I didn't know, I don't know if everything was all right. Thank you so much anyhow.
We lost you on your comments for the topics of the next meetings. If you could repeat those, please.
Okay, thank you. So I think that the human dimension topic is extremely important, mainly since, we have transformed the CSCE into OSCE. I believe that, the values are not really unique for all our countries. And we have to admit this diversity, and therefore I think that to address these topics, implementation of commitments and all related issues, topics to this one would be very, very important. So I cannot but welcome your proposals on this topic. The other one, the dialogue, improving dialogue, make OSCE if more effective, it's also important, obviously, but I think that one could be divided into more, narrow topics. But that one, I would think human dimension should have a priority because we could not hide, the truth. The truth is that there we have a very, very sensitive problem, and we have to address it courageously and to see what we can do indeed in working together based on values which to a great extent are common, but to some extent are not so very common. Thank you very much. I hope you got me.
Thank you, Mr. Severin. Thank you for your comments, and we look forward also to looking at your paper when you will share it with us. Next speaker is Mr. Joseph Italy, the head of the Swiss delegation. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador Sanier. Mr. President, dear colleagues, I hope you can understand me. On behalf of the Swiss delegation, let me express my full support to the OSCE PA initiative aiming to reinforce the institutional capacities of the OSCE. I would also like to thank the OSCE PA Secretariat for its work and the excellent non-papers that have been distributed. In July last year, Switzerland has been directly concerned when the Permanent Council of the OSCE failed to renew the heads of the OSCE institutions. The previous Secretary General of the OSCE, the Swiss diplomat Thomas Greminger, was among them. In Switzerland, this situation provoked not only a disappointment in view of the important work done for years by Mr. Greminger within the OSCE framework. The situation has also been a big matter of concern because of the institutional crisis that it provoked, leaving at the head of the OSCE institutions a vacuum for months. In my country, this situation has undermined the legitimacy and credibility of the organization, which was unfortunate in view of the strong Switzerland's commitment to the OSCE. Such a situation cannot happen again. It is why today's topic, the issue of the decision-making process in the frame of the organization, is so crucial. In my point of view, decisions such as a renewal of the heads of the OSCE institutions must involve the foreign ministers of the OSCE participating states. It would be a good way to show more political recognition and support to the main aims of the organization. On the topic of the principle of consensus, in the opinion of the Swiss delegation, this principle is the very essence of the OSCE, although we have to admit that it repeatedly caused blockades in the decision-making processes. Nevertheless, thanks to this principle applied to the political decisions, dialogue can be maintained in all circumstances. In spite of this and without questioning the principle of consensus, the Swiss delegation would be in favor of the introduction of a mechanism of accountability for countries blocking the consensus. It is also worth considering whether the OSCE's capacity to act would be improved by adopting majority voting applied to organizational and procedural decisions. The task may not be easy, but the OSCE would make a first step toward more efficiency in analyzing which decisions fall under political topics and could thus be made on the principle of consensus, and which of them fall under organizational topics and could be made on majority voting. On behalf of the Swiss delegation, I can only strongly encourage the carry-out of such an evaluation, which will provide a basis for further reflection. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ditley, and we have taken note also of your proposals, including the one on a mechanism of accountability, which is something we had also ourselves thought in putting together some food for thought. Next speaker is Benita Ferrero-Waldner. Benita, it's great to have you with us again, and of course, when it comes to consensus, you had direct experience as chairperson in office at some point.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Good afternoon. Yeah. First, Ambassador Zanier, President, and of course, distinguished members of this grouping. Let me say, indeed, I was chairperson in office in the year 2000, and therefore, I have a great interest in a more effective OSCE. But as Dr. Hamilton said, I know that the problems are not so much institutional, but they are really political. And if there is lack of political will, naturally, it's very difficult to get to decisions. But even so, having said that, I agree with you totally that we have to do something, at least trying to mitigate the consensus rules. I think consensus has to be there, but there is flexibility already with consensus -1, consensus -2, and the very interesting idea of Mr. Walsh, that the Troika and also the chairperson in office could do more on the decision-taking. On the other hand, I think we have to redefine those questions that are really merely political. There, I think consensus plus consensus -1 and -2 should be there. But for the administrative and budgetary questions, and also the questions for the further important authorities, one should indeed go for a different rule, maybe a sort of much more flexible rule. That I think is important. And for the rest, I think the OSCE should be, especially in times of tension again between East and West, a framework for dialogue, and would try to somehow narrow the differences, the political differences, in order then maybe to come to some sort of consensus rules or even to some sort of decisions. I think the OSCE should also focus strongly on where it has been best. For instance, field missions, crisis mitigation, and also election observations. And there, I think maybe it should be focusing more on these things and not go for everything, particularly not duplicate. This is my brief intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor Ferrero-Waldner, and thank you very much for sharing your considerations also from the perspective of your direct engagement as a chairperson in office. And yes, strengthening the role of the chairmanship is one of the ways. But of course, there are constraints in terms of decision taken that force the chairmanship to seek consensus also on organizational issues. So it's a bit of a circular problem that at some point will have to be addressed at the political level. Next speaker on the list, Mr. Kyriakos Adiani. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Firstly, I would like to express my appreciation for the non-paper which was circulated on a very crucial matter for the work of the OSCE. Admittedly, the abuse of the consensus rule may result in paralyzing the work of any organization, as it has often been the case for the OSCE. Examples of prolonged stalemate have been witnessed regarding the organization's leading positions and its budget. Hence, a repeated call by the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly to replace consensus with quality majority, at least in certain areas. However, in a tense political environment, as the one prevailing in the OSCE, it often proves very difficult to draw a line between matters with clear political implications and those of an administrative nature, as also recognized in the non-paper. The other side of the coin is reflected in the Helsinki Final Act, which provides that participating states will develop their cooperation with one another and with all states, with each of them making its contribution in conditions of full equality. In fact, the consensus rule ensures the effective participation of big and small states alike in equal terms. The consensus rule enabled the establishment of the CSE and remains a basic condition for the OSCE's existence today. It would therefore be extremely difficult, if not unrealistic, to change this rule and to achieve consensus in order to change it. Even in the unlikely scenario that this could somehow be made possible, mistrust and grudge on behalf of those feeling excluded would be exacerbated to the detriment of open dialogue and confidence building. In fact, most international organizations are based upon the same decision-making process. The abuse of this rule is not a challenge faced only by the OSCE. At the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly level, consensus fosters collective ownership of the decisions taken by the Standing Committee, thereby enhancing our Assembly's legitimacy and resilience. Undeniably, building consensus between 57 states with diverging security perceptions and interests is quite a challenge. But if it was possible to build consensus in 1975, it should also be possible today. Promoting dialogue and the effective use of the entire OSCE toolbox, as well as ensuring that the OSCE structures are unbiased and inclusive, can better serve the aims of this organization. At last point, international organizations that have been able to replace consensus with other decision-making procedures have one thing in common: a formal dispute settlement mechanism whose impartiality is not contested. Although such a mechanism also exists in the OSCE, regrettably, resource has never been sought to it. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm so sorry for that I don't have my camera to be open. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Diani. Thank you also for bringing in a perspective in your capacity as chair of the third committee of the Parliamentary Assembly. Next speaker is Ambassador Luca Frattini, who is the director of the Office of the Secretary General of the OSCE. Ambassador Frattini.
Mr. Chair, dear Lamberto, Mr. President, distinguished members of the Parliamentary Assembly, Secretary General Montella, first of all, thank you. It's an honor for me to be a guest in this distinguished meeting to discuss a very important topic. And I would like to very briefly, in just a few seconds, offer you some perspective from the inside of the organization after having served for 3 years in the whole Troika configuration as incoming, then in the chairmanship team, and then as outgoing chair. Now I am in the secretariat. So I think I can confirm most of what has been said about the great value that participating states attach to the consensus rule. I can definitely say that participating states would be extremely reluctant to abandon their ultimate right to block any decision to which they strongly object as a matter of policy or principle. However, it is equally clear that representatives of many, if not most, participating states find it frustrating, and I witnessed that firsthand, when the need for consensus is used by others to block decisions for tactical reasons or as a bargaining chip to gain advantage on unrelated issues. So the question that you are debating today, I think, is crucial. And really, how might one make it more difficult to block unrelated decisions? It has already been said that a category could be identified, a category of decisions could be identified for which consensus will not be needed in the future. But we all know that this is an extremely difficult path, not impossible, but definitely challenging. I would like to offer a couple of side considerations that, without maybe touching the consensus as a principle, might contribute to freeing up some negotiating space for more substantial topics. The first one would be to negotiate a package deal or an omnibus decision on the broad dates and maybe even the main agenda items to be covered in key annual meetings. For instance, the Human Dimension Implementation Meeting, the Prague Economic and Environmental Forum, the Annual Security Review Conference. In short, those annual meetings that we know are mandated and we have every year. So instead of maybe having one negotiation per each or even more, because some of these meetings require 2 or 3 decisions by the Permanent Council every year, why not try to put forward an omnibus decision capturing that in the form of a yearly calendar of the organization. And finally, a second proposal, and I'm sure this is not directly part of this topic, but you as the PA will look into it possibly in future meetings of this format. The appropriateness of maintaining a yearly and time-consuming budget cycle negotiation could also be further explored. It is not directly linked to consensus, but I am convinced, again, from the inside, that not having this never-ending budget discussion, which even results in paradoxes like Now we don't have an adopted budget for 2021, but we are already working on the budget for 2022. It may be avoiding this never-ending cycle could free up some space for more substantial debates. Thank you very much for your attention.
So Frattini, thank you for sharing with us also the direct experience from a recent chairmanship and the presence in the Troika. One issue that perhaps we should return to is how can a chairmanship take over a larger responsibility, maybe through additional accountability towards participating states? Is it only a question of how a country interprets the chairmanship, or would other conditions exist? Would have also to explore the mechanism of accountability was mentioned by a number of you. How can that be developed? Who should develop that, and how can we move in that direction? The point of the differentiation between decisions that require consensus and others will be much more complicated, I suppose, and they should not be discarded, but certainly this would require an in-depth discussion, perhaps an expert advice of some kind to support that kind of decision. But it will be a political decision inevitably, and therefore it will become not easy. So next speaker on the list is Mr. Peter Juel-Jansen. Is the head of the Danish delegation, and he's also the treasurer of the OSCE. So maybe there are also comments on the admin side of things. Please, Mr. Juel-Jansen.
Thank you. So good to see you all. In Denmark, hairdressers, they are closed. I can see in your countries, they're not closed. You look so good, and that is very nice for me, because I'm starting to look like a real Viking. But thank you very much for an interesting meeting today. It is indeed some very interesting questions that we discuss, and I hope that we together may find some solid answers to the challenges we face. I may have missed something. It should not be the first time, but I must admit that I'm a bit confused about the two initiatives that Lamberto Sagnier and Andreas Natali are in charge of. How do they interact with each other? Could someone please elaborate on the time frame for this call on action working group, and specify the working plan for this with the time frame, venue, key issues on the agenda of its planned meetings? And could I also please specify how this could play into the work that Andreas Natali with the revision on the rules of procedures are doing? Actually, I think that it might be a good idea, like the president said, to have a time frame, key issues, and meetings for the two initiatives laid out in writing. Would it be possible for you also to send that to the working group? That was a question. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Juel-Jansen. For this, perhaps either the president or the secretary general might wish also to intervene and provide you details and considerations. My only point at this stage would be that, for instance, when it comes to decision-making procedures, we are talking about the intergovernmental side, whereas the rules of procedure apply to the parliamentary side. So that would be the main differentiation between the two things. But on this, I leave it for the president or the secretary general to intervene as they deem it appropriate. I see the secretary general is nodding. Roberto, do you want to intervene now? Please, you have the floor.
If you like, yeah, maybe I can just clarify very briefly. For the call for action plus 50, the initiatives that is under the responsibility of Ambassador Sagnier, that is an initiative that is triggered by the Bureau, but it's an initiative addressed to the entire OSCE family. It's the proposal that the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly has made to the OSCE and to all those who have served the OSCE during the years in order to strengthen this organization. It was said today, one of the biggest problems of the organization is the lack of political attention to the organization, the lack of political will. this initiative addresses exactly that problem. So there's a series of events. You will come on the issue of dialogue or on the human dimension. So we'll have a set of events, and indeed there will be a calendar and there will be a time frame for these events leading to Helsinki Plus 50. But this is an offer of the Parliamentary Assembly to the entire OSCE community, to all of those who have served the OSCE in the past. You can see in this call there are former chairperson in office like Benita, like Adrian Severin, and others I'm sure I'm missing, but there are former holders of office like Christian Stroll, who was the director of the ODIHR. So here you have the entire OSCE family and the offer of the OSCE parliamentarians to address the challenges that the OSCE has. The other issue, Mr. Treasurer, that you mentioned about Andres Notel and the rules of procedure, that is more an internal OSCE Parliamentary Assembly business, and that's why some of the members in this call might be confused about that. Here, when you hear about issues of rules of procedures, it's indeed the OSCE government, intergovernmental side, you know, the way the OSCE works by consensus. What Andres Notel is doing is within our own Parliamentary Assembly, and it's a revision of our own rules of procedures. So this has nothing to do with this event. So they are two totally separate events. And I also apologize to the members who are in this call who probably do not know our own internal OSCE Parliamentary Assembly procedures. We are in the process of also modernizing our own rules of procedures. But this is detached from this discussion here. So I hope I've clarified this.
Thank you very much. Unless the President wants to add anything from his side, I would continue with the list of speakers. The next speaker I have is the head of the Romanian delegation, Mr. Radu Mihail. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and dear panelists and participants. Today, the OSCE's founding document is still of great validity, and the efforts that you are all making to ensure that it stays relevant and efficient for the years ahead, it's of utmost importance. And I'd like to congratulate the Parliamentary Assembly for the initiative it launched. I think the Assembly has a privileged place because it makes the link between the OSCE as a governmental organization and the people in the OSCE area. And well, we have the parliamentarians who are gathered and represent directly those who are impacted by the actions that the OSCE is taking. So the constant efforts to strengthen the role and effectiveness of OSCE in addressing new challenges, it's essential to be pursued with determination from a parliamentary assembly perspective, of course. And in this context, I would like to thank you for the non-paper on managing consensus. It points to real problems. It raises pertinent questions, and there are suggestions there. But let me add another layer to what's in there. It's the importance of giving priority to the core business of the OSCE, and in particular to resolution of conflicts. Active conflicts, protracted conflicts, all these things that gravely undermine the European security and the climate of trust amongst us. And I believe that the decision-making process that we are working to get improved, whatever that format might be, it has to be adapted to serve the main purpose that I've mentioned before. We want to make sure that the priorities we have are served and the organization can work more efficiently given the changes we are likely to propose in the way in which decisions are being taken. So let me conclude by expressing my full confidence that our discussion will provide enough elements that in the next period would allow us to evolve as an organization and be able to fulfill the important roles that were defined for us so many years ago. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you for your comments. I have one last speaker, after which, unless there is anybody else who wants to intervene, I would go back to the members of the panel to see if they have any comments in the light of the discussion, and then, of course, we will hear from the President, Lord Bowness, some concluding remarks. So the next is Dame Odie Glover, a former ODIHR director and still very much engaged in OSCE activities, especially in the election and observation side.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Zanier, Mr. President. And thank you indeed also for the paper, which has been most helpful and useful. And it's a great pleasure to be here today. As we all know, the OSCE is a unique organization, both in relation to its membership and also its mandate. And it has been effective over the years, but sadly, recently, it has not been able to fulfill its initial promise. The consensus rule is very important, but increasingly seems to be preventing the organization from fulfilling its mandate. So it's timely for some imaginative and creative thinking by the participating states. It has been suggested that if there is a particular situation where there is opposition to the consensus rule, the state or states concerned should explain why they are opposed to it, in the hope that it can sort out discussion. And I think this is a very good idea, which I would support. Also, the consensus -1 and -2 mechanisms that already exist could be examined perhaps more carefully and adapted for certain issues relating to procedural and administrative matters. Indeed, it would be most helpful if the whole subject was looked at and discussed perhaps by the Ministerial Council or even by foreign ministers. And in addition, of course, the OSCE-PA could play a very constructive role. But the time has certainly come for a concerted effort to ensure that the OSCE once again will be able to fulfill its potential. And in relation to future discussions, I also think that it would be an extremely good idea to look at the challenges in relation to the commitments in the human dimension. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Dave Clark. So unless there is anybody else at this stage, I would revert to the panelists, with the only exception Dan Hamilton, who had to leave because he's teaching this afternoon, so he had another commitment he had to move on to. So I would like to ask, first of all, Mr. Walsh, Stephen, you heard quite a few points and quite a few comments also to your initial introduction. Do you have any comments you would like to make at this point?
Very few, Ambassador. Thank you very much for coming back to me. I'm very conscious that I don't have any mandate to make comments, but I've heard very interesting suggestions, and the ideas such as having an obligation on countries, on participating states who are preventing consensus from being reached, to explain the reasons that for not agreeing to the consensus are very, very interesting. And as a legal practitioner, if called upon, I and my colleagues would be very, very happy to put our minds to coming up with some written proposals for such ideas, but it wouldn't be for me to comment on the proposals, if you'll excuse me, dodging the issue. If I may just clarify, there was a question from Mr. Hamilton about the use of the consensus -1 that he sought clarification from me on from 1992. And indeed, I can confirm, as he had put forward, that the mechanism was put in place before it was used in that particular context with regard to the former Yugoslavia, Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. It was put in place in a way that in the Prague decision of 92, it didn't refer to the term consensus -1. It referred to, I have it here in front of me, it's from Article 4, Section 16, and it might be helpful just to put it on the record here because it is a very interesting formulation, I think. And it states that the council, the equivalent of today's permanent council, if necessary, in the absence of the consent of the state concerned, in cases of clear, gross and uncorrected violations of the relevant CSE commitments, can implement a decision to take an activity or an action, I beg your pardon. But the key point is that that action is very, very restricted. It's that action would consist of political declarations or political steps to apply outside the territory of the state concerned. So the existing method of the consensus -1 is very, very restricted. But my point was that the principle is there, that there is the concept that there can be something else for other than consensus, and that is perhaps that the door is a little bit open for people to come up with new ideas, and we'd be happy to put our minds to that if requested. Thank you, Ambassador Zanier, again.
Thank you very much, Stephen. In the meantime, we have another 2-3 requests of the floor. Let me ask whether any of the other panelists would like to come in at the stage. I see Margareta Sederfeld. Please, you have the floor. Yes, yes.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Zanier. It has really been a very interesting discussion so far, and I must say I have enjoyed it very much. And one thought I got immediately when I have listened to all the speeches here and interventions is that, is the consensus the real problem or not? Are we discussing the ways to make discussions, to make decisions, just because we want to avoid the political dimension? Because what everybody here have said is the difficulties with the political issue. And I say this because when OSCE was formed, it was the Cold War. It was very high tension. And today we are back in an era with very high level of tension. And I think this really shows the importance of OSCE, both the governmental side and the parliamentarian side. I find it relevant to discuss the ways we make decisions in the organization, both from the parliamentarians, OSCE-PA, as well as OSCE. But we shouldn't let this discussion be, what should I say, something that take over the political dimension, because as was raised here from my colleague from Romania about the European security order. I think that's something that's very relevant with its 3 dimensions. The human dimension, the political dimension, the security dimension, and what's new on the arena is the environment, because it haven't been discussed earlier. Maybe the consensus is very relevant to discuss, but I also found here what was said, that with the explanations of reasons why not agreeing to the consensus. Maybe that's a very good and relevant part to add to this discussion, because it could be a way forward. What I also would like to say, if we should be more relevant, because I think I raised this issue in the beginning, we need to be more relevant as an organization. And this means to do what we are very good on, the election observations. Everybody knows about the OSCE, OSCE-PA's election missions. But it's also to develop the parliamentary diplomacy, and maybe also to find other ways where we could have impact, and maybe work a bit closer the governmental and the parliamentarian side, because we are not like the national parliament who scrutinize our government. I don't see that it could be possible to scrutinize government in the organization like OSCE, as we are working in another framework. But maybe it's possible. It needs just more discussion. That's my thoughts from the discussion we have hold now, and if I understood right, there will be some more intervention, and I think this shows the importance to work further on with the call for action, because there are ideas how to tackle the today's problem and challenges. Thank you very much, Ambassador Sanier, and I would also like to say thank you to the OSCE Secretariat and Secretary General Roberto Montella for arranging this webinar. Thank you.
Sorry, I was muted myself. I see Azai Guliev who wants to intervene. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Ambassador Zanier. I will be very short. As we all witnessed that some of our colleagues have raised the issue of the lack of the attention from government side. This is, of course, the main key issue that we have been discussing for many years, how we can increase the level of interaction between the executive branch and the parliamentarians. This is why I do believe that whatever we have been discussed now, if we don't have a set of, let's say, cooperation with the government side, it would become a bit difficult for their realization or materialization of whatever I have been saying. This is why there were very interesting, very good ideas brought up by their colleagues. I think that we have to find some mechanism where we can really engage the Ministerial Council or other instruments or institution of the OSCE that is available. As you know, that we have only one chance a year to have an interaction or to have a discussion with the Ministerial Council, but unfortunately, it is not enough. This is why, Mr. Ambassador, maybe it would make a sense to have some discussion with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Troika countries, because it is impossible to have all the ministerial or the others, of course, but at least the Troika countries is available. We can initiate this, let's say, proposal and ask the Troika countries Minister of Foreign Affairs at least to discuss what things our parliamentary assembly, what is our position, how we can combine our common efforts in the name of having, as we already mentioned, the Helsinki plus 50 in appropriate way in order not to repeat the previous mistakes and to be more, let's say, effective and to be more, I mean, just make sure that our voice is heard. This is why my suggestion is maybe Secretary General Montella can also comment on that, or maybe in the future to invite at least, or even if it is not possible to invite 3 of them, but at least we can invite the current Minister for Foreign Affairs head of the OSCE or chairmanship officer to the bureau meeting to discuss, to get the feedback from their Ministerial Council. Otherwise, I have a feeling that we will say, let's exchange of our opinions and we make a good speeches, but what is else? What concrete outcomes shall be produced? This is a main question. This is why in my speech, Mr. Ambassador, I raised this issue, particular issue that it is a right time for us to think of these particular ways of engagement, of making sure that everything is going in the right direction. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Mr. Guliev. Of course, this is a question that the President will have to think about and to discuss also in the appropriate forums, but it's well noted. I have Vice President Kari Henriksen now. Please.
Thank you very much. And thank you for a very fruitful discussion with many different views on the theme. And that's a good ground for making solutions. I think we have to be clear in define what problem are we seeking solutions to. Are this problem or this challenge mainly political? Then we must have political solutions to that. And in that regard, I think the dialogue, as also Asai mentioned, between the leadership in the Ministerial Council and the Bureau is important. So I think also that the discussion about the consensus rule has many implications. And I would like to repeat the saying that it takes consensus to change consensus. And I think we have to have a political dialogue to start the movement to address this, because it has also some downsides, as I can see it. In Europe and also in our region, there are political movements that are working against our goals in the OSCE and our values. And we can maybe risk that some decisions that is in the core of the OSCE could fall when we are taking decisions. So I think that is also a possibility we have to consider, and we have to find good solutions so that we know that the way we choose to go further will be in accordance with our values. So I think also that the further discussion on the way forward must be have a good anchorage in the PA structures. And I think that the issues and the moments that have been taken up today can be taken further to the Bureau Understanding Committee in the OSCE, so that we can have a further discussion on what the PA organs does want to go take further. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me interject, listening to this discussion, with a couple of points based on my experience as I was Secretary General. I always felt that the consensus push at the limit was resulting into kind of micromanagement of the organization by the delegations. And it was really difficult to do anything without having a decision. And then at some point I created myself a space for us to intervene and to try to move ahead in a way that was transparent, consultative and all that, but try not to rely on consensus every time. And I started saying that in the OSCE, it is easier to do things than it is to decide to do the same things. There is, and with the, taking some responsibility on the side of the leadership, especially the chairmanship, there is a space where things can be done. For instance, one of the things I did at the time was to introduce the security days. And the security days don't require a decision. It was an initiative by the Secretary General, and it's still there. And one example of that was one on migration that I did, where in a situation where there were countries objecting to put migration on the agenda of the organization, I said, I'll organize security day. I invited high-level speakers from various places, and it was a really high-level event. And then everybody was present there. And that started the debate, and then started work in this, overcoming the diffidence of some who really were not inclined to put it on the agenda. So sometimes doing things is a good way of starting processes. So maybe, and yes, it is very political. So you need to have a sense also, a good sense of what can be done and where there are red lines. So don't even try it, otherwise you create a major crisis. So those are some experiences that I had myself. But I see that with this discussion, we have provoked additional thoughts by some. I have 3 more speakers, and I would like to begin with Mr. Nikolaos Samarkadze, please.
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to follow up on my Romanian colleague's remark that one of the biggest challenges in the OSCE security in the OSCE area is conflicts and interstate conflicts that are not regulated. And here clearly the problem is a political one. And therefore, when we think about the ways ahead, we should think about not only the rule of consensus, but also what kind of enforcement mechanisms we have in order to enforce those decisions that are made by the OSCE. And in this regard, I think, I mean, me as a head of delegation of the country, which has been a victim of blockages of OSCE decisions since the early 2000s, we clearly see the need for a change. And whether it will be a consensus -1 or consensus -2, or the justification for why a certain country is blocking a decision which the overall the overwhelming majority is voting for, this could be the very good first steps forward. However, I think that this would not complete the picture. We would need more enforcement mechanisms in order to have that, in order to get to a final objective of having OSCE as an organization which copes to modern day challenges. Thank you.
I failed to unmute myself. I apologize. Thank you very much for your remarks. And the next speaker is Ambassador Stroal. Christian, you have the floor. And good to see you.
Thank you, Lamberto, and thank you for inviting me as a guest to this. As someone who has lived through 2 chairmanships and an institution, maybe one point, and you mentioned part of it, Lamberto, yourself. The OSCE is a non-consensual organization where the decisions are taken by consensus. And the key consensus manager, the manager to bring consensus somewhat about in this non-consensual organization is the chair, with the support of the Secretary General. And there are all sorts of practices to bring this about through the Troika, group of friends, envoys, even informal ministerial councils, or simply doing by doing, as you have mentioned yourself. So the real problem is, as Benita said, the political will on the one hand, and the micromanagement, or if I would be unkind to say, the bureaucratic abuse of the consensus principle. And so what we would need is find a way to simply allow the chair and the SG and the heads of institutions to do their work as they have been appointed, and not to sort of come up. We all can think of a lot of examples of this abuse from bigger decisions, such as not allowing a new participating state to have a field mission, down to individual positions in individual field missions being blocked by a neighboring country. So all sorts of areas where it would be in any other organization very clearly said, you are out of order. This is not part of this particular decision-making process. And so one answer, I think, to that is also to see how parliaments at the national level can maybe have more hearings about what happens in the OSCE, especially if decisions are not being taken. Also bring in representatives from the OSCE, maybe more regularly, and question their own minister why, for example, it was not possible to appoint the 4 heads last year in time. So just to create a stronger political momentum to allow decisions where they are necessary to be taken in time, and where they are not necessary, work to be just continuing. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Christian. The next speaker is Mrs. Farah Karimi.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. I actually can build up on what Mr. Stroll said, because if the lack of political will is a problem, and I guess it is a problem, then, and we are all politicians, I mean, I guess there is no doubt about it, as parliamentarians, we are politicians, that means that we have to take political actions. And the best actually platform for taking political actions is our own national parliaments, because I can't imagine that the governments, without really being under pressure to give up on consensus, they will do that. I can't imagine that. So because this is just really a matter of, you know, understanding of power relations. So my suggestion would be, as we move further and we are thinking about the next steps, and really think about how to increase the you know, the political attention for OSCE and everything what OSCE is doing, also to pay attention to what we can do in our own national parliaments. And I was very happy to hear what Benita was saying, so that it is also very important to understand the importance of the really actions are taken by OSCE. You know, the election observations, the missions, and the security mitigation activities. I think if we could really, you know, make that understood in a broader context of our national parliaments, then we can create a kind of, you know, momentum and to, you know, to go further and have the next steps on it. But just start debating on consensus and change the, you know, the consensus rule and create a consensus about it, I would be quite pessimistic in the current political situation to get really people to move in that direction. So I'm really very looking forward to, you know, next steps of what we are doing, and I hope that we will be more focused than in a kind of, you know, a general debate. So that would be really very helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carini, for your comments, and we've taken note of that, and we will also discuss and see how we can make this happen. Now, before giving the floor for final remarks to Secretary General Montella and to the President, Lord Bowness, let me just point out one other issue. Vice President Alizar was supposed to intervene at the very beginning, but he got taken up with the debate in the French Senate, and he couldn't really link up with us. But he asked me to pass on one suggestion that he had in mind. I wanted to put forward this meeting, and I will read from the speaking notes he gave to me, looking at the, he says, the mandate that we have as OSCE parliamentarian. I would suggest that in view of the coming anniversary of our organization, so the Helsinki Final Act, the French Senate host a seminar at the Palais du Luxembourg in Paris, where the heads of delegations could elaborate on one of the two following themes. So either reflecting on the considerable changes undergone by the concept of the rule of law since 1973 and how the OSCE PA helped promote this concept, or which historical and political developments led from Cold War to frozen conflicts and how these two notions relate to each other. Not easy themes, any of them, but interesting, certainly. So I put this to you on his behalf, and he would welcome any feedback and any comments from you on his suggestion. With this, I will now pass the floor to Secretary General Montella. Roberto.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Zanier. Thank you very much for your leadership and the moderation of this debate. I must say I'm very pleased on how the discussion is developing, and I think we are going exactly in the right direction, especially the last interventions where you have clearly come to the conclusion that the challenge we have is the lack of political attention at the highest level of governments. And here I just wanted to make a side remark, because Vice President Zaguliev mentioned the cooperation between the governmental side of the OSCE and the parliamentary side. The cooperation has never been as good as it is now. You know, we have some members who are on this call. I refer to Ambassador Glover and Strohel. They know how it was tense in the past, the relationship between the OSCE and the ODIHR in particular, but the relationship is excellent. So there is not an issue of OSCE parliamentary side and OSCE governmental side. And that's why actually the parliamentary side here is hosting a debate to address the challenges that the OSCE governmental side has and wants to contribute. And as you've all identified, the challenge we have is indeed the lack of political attention. So as Kari and Fariman mentioned, the issue that you are politicians, so you need to address at a higher level in your own governments to put enough attention to this organization. Now, we have gathered here in this call and in this group that has met already a couple of times now, all those who have served the OSCE, all those who know the OSCE. I said in an informal meeting once, all those who love the OSCE. You have all the secretary generals, all the former CIOs, all the former directors. So you have people who know the organization, who know what this organization does. Reference was made before to what the organization does. And I would like to bring you some figures and the paradox that we are, as we are having this call in this very moment, there certainly is some monitor in Donbass who is meeting some people there under also security considerations. Maybe there is an officer in Bishkek speaking to students in Central Asia. There is maybe an officer in Belgrade meeting an authority in its capital talking about the minority rights of Albanians in southern Serbia. Maybe there is a leader in an autonomous institution discussing the issue of dialogue with some countries who have difficulties. So it's not only the field, but it's also the headquarters of the OSCE. There is an ODIHR officer in Bulgaria preparing the ground for the assessment that we will do in this election observation mission in Bulgaria, EU country. So we observe East and West. That's another thing that we have to underline. So there is a lot of work that is being done as we speak in this moment by around 3,000 plus officers of the OSCE, whose budget, and Luca Frattini put it very well, has not been approved yet. And we're not talking about billions, we're talking about 130 plus million, which if you know today's figures that we are discussing with the recovery funds, I mean, 130 million is really very little resources for all this activity that is happening. By the way, of these 3,000, around 530 also got COVID during this year. Let's not forget that one died, but 530 plus, so this is the figures of 2 weeks ago, also got COVID during this period, which is quite a high number. So you have so much people who are doing so much work for such a little money. Nobody knows about it. Some ministers, of course, who have issues where the OSCE deals with, they pay attention to the organization, but some others basically leave in total disinterest this organization. So that's why it's important that we have these initiatives, because we raise political attention from the leaders who are in this call and from the others who are not in these calls but are currently serving the Parliamentary Assembly to engage. And on this issue of the discussion today, I don't want to enter too much in the merit, but of course we know that the consensus rule is something that is kind of a pillar of this organization. Is not going to change. I mean, I don't think the governmental side will ever move into what we have in the Parliamentary Assembly, where we vote by majority and where we can indeed say where there are clear, gross and uncorrected violations. As some members mentioned that sentence. Here in the Parliamentary Assembly, we can say it because we vote by majority. But in the governmental side, it's not going to happen. We know that. But I think we should look into the direction that also Luca Frattini indicated here, you know, some practical and feasible ways, maybe a budget cycle of 2 years, thus indeed allowing the people who work in the organization to have enough resources to do their job and not engaging the participating states in endless discussion in Vienna about the old budget and the new budget. And the idea also of not having to discuss by consensus each and single agenda of each meeting and what, you know, because every meeting we know begins with the chairmanship address, with the secretary general address, why all of these agendas, which are more or less always the same, need to go through a consensus. So omnibus decision, Luca Frattini said it. probably mille proroghe you have in mind in Italy. In Italy, we have this idea of having one law that is all encompassing. So maybe that's also a viable solution. But this is just my little contribution on the consensus rule. But in general, I just wanted to thank everybody who has intervened. I think we're going in the right direction. It's still a little bit, and I can see some members are saying, but what is it that we're doing? Is it still a bit vague? Maybe it is, but we will learn on what we are doing with this process as we go along. And again, Ambassador Zanni, thank you very much for steering the debate, because I think you're touching exactly the key issues here. Consensus, dialogue next time will be also very important. So congratulations to all of those who have spoken. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. Now, President Lord Bowness, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Ambassador and Secretary General. I don't want to repeat what's been said by many people this afternoon, but I would just reflect on this, that we opened with a very interesting discussion from Stephen Walsh, the head of legal affairs. And I say it was very interesting because I am a lawyer, and there are many interesting discussions to be had about the legal ins and outs of the consensus rule and all the rules of the OSCE. I think, however, tempting though that might be for the lawyers, it won't get us anywhere. Nobody other than the other lawyers will be very interested, and it certainly will not spark the political interest and attention that we actually all require. Dr. Dan Hamilton said, and I made a note, that we need to be grounded by reality, and the problems are political rather than bureaucratic. I think he summed that up in a very short phrase, and it's been reflected in many, many of the contributions that we've had this afternoon. It is our great problem, not just in connection with the consensus rule, but with anything else to do with the OSCE, to get ministers interested in what we are doing, to get space in our parliamentary agendas to discuss it. I heard one of the contributors, and I've forgotten, I think it was Dr. Stoll, that there should be parliamentary hearings. A great idea, but we actually have to build up an influence with our ministers before that is going to happen. We do have an opportunity for dialogue with the chair in office and the Secretary General. And I would just say to Vice President Aze that we do have the opportunity for discussion with these office holders at least 2 out of our 3 statutory meetings, and as we're doing currently in the present circumstances, at meetings to which, online meetings to which they're invited of the Bureau and the Standing Committee. But I do have to say to members of the Parliamentary Assembly, we throw that opportunity away most of the time, because instead of questioning the chairman in office or the Secretary General about what he or she is doing, we come with our own particular problems and our set piece, and we say it irrespective of who is there and the opportunity which we are missing. Now, I have to say, because in case I'm misunderstood, I know that all these problems are urgent. I know that they are very serious for the countries concerned, for their representatives. I have been an advocate of finding a place in OSCE Parliamentary Assembly agendas where restricted to discussion of those sort of problems. And I stand by that. But I do believe that we should not throw away the opportunities that we have to discuss, as I say, with the chair in office and the Secretary General. I hope that we will be able to bring to future meetings a plan of where we're going, how we're going, why we're going. But one thing is clear to me, is the message that's come over this afternoon, that whatever the problem, whatever the technicalities, it is the political interest of national governments which will make a change. And as a throwaway notion, which I have not discussed with anybody, and everybody can come and tell me what a silly idea it is when we're offline, not on, please. we all know where the problems lie in the Permanent Council at the present moment. Should we not initiate a discussion with the Russian Federation and any other states that perhaps present particular problems? It can be entirely without prejudice for either side, but we all know where the problem is, and we're not talking to the people. And if we say it's a political situation, we are not going to resolve it by changing any rules and however many papers and we produce and seminars that we have. Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for contributing. I'm sorry to have taken more of your time at the end than I intended, but I can only say that is a tribute to the contributions which we have received this afternoon, which stimulated me to make this closing remarks. Thank you so much.
President, if you don't mind, I see that Mr. Gurria would like to clarify something in relation to your latest comments. Can I give him back the floor and then you can say one final word, Mr. President?
Thank you, Ambassador Zania. I will be too short. I, of course, thank Secretary General and President Lord Bonis on their comments on my suggestion. But I deem it necessary to make some clarification because I fully agree with Roberto and also with President Bonis that we have good relationship with the executive branch of our organization. But when I suggested to have the meeting with the Troika countries, I meant exactly to discuss whatever we are going to plan, whatever we are going to discuss, because this paper that was elaborated by Ambassador Zanio is very crucial, very important. This is why I am remaining in my proposal that it would be great if we could engage our Minister of Foreign Affairs to discuss particular issues. I am not talking about the general relationship or general interactions, which is very good. But my concern is, what is the next step? After having prepared this paper and after having prepared some call for actions, what is else? I do believe that in close cooperation with the government side, we can achieve many things rather than having the isolated circle. This is why Roberto and Mr. Peter Bonis, I am just saying that if it is possible in some coming bureau meetings to invite them online discussions, I don't know what is possible, just to brief about our positions, because it would be great if we directly brief our positions, opinion of the topic that we discussed, then let us get their feedback. So thank you very much, Ambassador Zanio, for giving me a chance to clarify whatever I suggested. Thank you.
So, President, I would like to come in again and comment on this. This is, of course, the leadership of the Parliamentary Assembly that should decide on, how to operationalize as much as possible this discussion.
But can I just say thank him for clarifying the position. I've no objection to people coming to bureau meetings, standing committee meetings, so long as we don't have too many speakers that we can't conduct our own business that needs to be conducted. But I think in connection with this paper, it's part and parcel of where this where this event, as it's described this afternoon, where this initiative is going. And I think Ambassador Zanier has agreed that we are going to, in conjunction with the Bureau, establish the sort of route that we intend to follow over what time and what we're actually going to do. And I'm sure that is one of the things that we can take account of.
Sure. So thank you very much, President. Thanks to all of you. This was a lively debate. It was interesting. We will try to put together the key points that emerge and circulate a perception paper or some kind of a summary of the discussion. And then, of course, in the other appropriate fora, we will decide how to follow up also these things to avoid that we stop at the stage short of taking an initiative of some kind. So thank you very much. Have a good rest of the afternoon or the day, depending on where you are. And thank you for contributing to this discussion.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Very much, everybody. Thanks for contributions. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.